Welcome back, everybody, to our ongoing study of the Gospel of Mark. This week we're looking at Mark chapter 9, verses 1 through 13. And there we're going to hear a story that's very familiar to us. We often call it the story of the Transfiguration, but it will be followed by a short text that's not familiar to us. And part of our challenge is going to see how they work together. Now, if you'd like to join us for a discussion Wednesday night at 7 p.m. Pacific time, you just write us at this address. We'll send you the Zoom link, and we'll be happy to see you there. But first, let's just see where we've been, where we're going between now and the end of October. So last week, we looked at the story of where Jesus says, "Who do people say that I am?" Peter says, "You are the Messiah." Jesus rebukes them for that. And then Peter rebukes Jesus for saying he's going to die. And then Jesus rebukes Peter back. Rebukes all around last week. This week we're looking at the Transfiguration story, in which there's a Peter fail. Simon Peter is going to blurt out and ruin everything. Maybe it's a minor fall, but at any rate, he gets kind of smacked down by the voice from heaven. So we're seeing a failure there. The week after that, next week, we're going to look at a healing story where the disciples fail. And then we're going to hear the second disclosure of Jesus journeying to the cross. The disciples will fail. We're going to hear a test about divorce, and the disciples will fail. We're going to hear the story of the rich man and the third disclosure of Jesus going to the cross, and James and John are going to fail. Then we'll end our semester here with the story of blind Bartimaeus, who does not fail. So, we've got a lot of failure getting ready to happen. Just put your crash helmets on, and we'll follow all of this together. Now, for today, we're in Mark chapter 9, verses 1 through 13, and here's a brief outline of that. It begins with the first verse, but that's a very controversial placement of this verse, and we'll talk about that when we get to it. But the question about verse 1 is this the beginning of something, or is it the end of something, or is it a transition of some sort? And then in verses 2 through 9, we're going to see what's typically called the Transfiguration story. And then following that, we've got a little conversation about Elijah. So, without any further ado, let's read through the whole text, verses 1 through 13 from the New Revised Standard Version. And Jesus said to them, "Truly I tell you, there are some standing here who will not taste death until they see that the kingdom of God has come with power." 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John and led them up a high mountain apart by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his clothes became dazzling white, such as no one on earth could bleach them. And there appeared to them Elijah with Moses, who were talking with Jesus. Then Peter said to Jesus, "Rabbi, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He did not know what to say, for they were terrified. Then a cloud overshadowed them, and from the cloud came a voice, "This is my son, the beloved. Listen to him." Suddenly, when they looked around, they saw no one with them anymore, but only Jesus. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus ordered them to tell no one what they had seen until after the Son of Man had risen from the dead. So they kept the matter to themselves, questioning what this rising from the dead could mean. Then they asked him, "Why do the scribes say that Elijah must come first?" He said to them, "Elijah is indeed coming first to restore all things. How then is it written about the Son of Man that he is to go through many sufferings and be treated with contempt? But I tell you that Elijah has come, and they did to him what they pleased, as it is written about him." So this ends our reading, and as you can see, we had that first verse, and then we had the story of the Transfiguration, then we have this curious conversation following. We'll want to pay attention to some of the details of the story of the Transfiguration. I'm really intrigued by that conversation after, but I am going to confess to you right up front, I am not sure what to make of it. So we'll just throw around some possibilities and see what happens. Going back to verse 1 then, this is my translation. And Jesus was saying to them, Amen, I say to you that there are some who are standing here who will not taste death until they see the reign of God has come in power. So the real question here is, does this verse, does it end the last reading, or does it begin the next reading? So whoever added chapters and verses to the scriptures interpreted this as the beginning of the next story. So it is verse 1 of chapter 9. It's not verse 39 of chapter 8. So whoever did the versification and chapter divisions many years ago in what we now know decided that this goes with the story of the Transfiguration. But I would say most of your Bibles probably have a subtitle between verses 1 and 2. And it's probably a subtitle that reads something like the Transfiguration story or something like that. And what that tells you is that the group of scholars who not only translated that text, but also then broke it into readable segments, are actually interpreting that this is more of either the end of chapter 8 or a standalone verse all by itself. The content of the verse is what really matters, okay? So maybe this does conclude chapter 8, verses 27 through 38. You might remember that there the disciples are told to take up their cross and to follow. And maybe this is a promise to those who have been told to take up their cross and follow, who have been told to take a hard journey, who have been told to take on the possibility of being put to death by Rome for sedition, and which is the reason why Rome would crucify somebody on a cross. Maybe this is a way of assuring those folks who are hearing this call to this very hard journey, whether it's the 12 and those around them to whom Jesus was talking in chapter 8, or whether it's Mark's community that knows very well the dangers of being a disciple of Jesus under the Roman Empire. Maybe what this is a promise to them that not all of us will die. Some of us will actually hang in there and see the fulfillment of the time for which we're longing. That's a possibility. I'm a little wary of putting too much stock into presuming that we can know what the reign of God coming in power means to first century Galileans like the 12, or the first century Gentile Christians to whom Mark seems to be writing this gospel. It is a phrase that reminds us of Daniel. It is a phrase that we will hear later in Mark's gospel, so it does seem like some of the expectations of that late Second Temple Jewish movement, of which the latter half of Daniel is a product, some of those expectations are at play in Mark's mind, and perhaps in Mark's readers' mind. But I'm a little wary of pretending that we know a whole lot about that. And I think the biblical witness from the Old Testament and even some of those intertestamental books, which is where I would actually put second half of Daniel, even those show me that the idea of what it means to say the reign of God has come in power is more of a contested conversational idea than it is a fixed idea. Nonetheless, it was a hope. And as a hope, perhaps this follows what happens in chapter 8, where the call to discipleship is really amped up to a call to take up one's cross and to face the possibility of death. It could be, I think this is a real possibility, that what it means to see the reign of God has come in power means you've seen Jesus on the cross. And that would be relying on the whole paradox that in that moment of humiliating weakness, strength and power are delivered or made apparent. It could be that the cross, while it looks like Rome's finest hour, is actually that lynch point, that turn where the hubris of Rome is uncovered. The system of scapegoating is uncovered. The myth of violent redemption is uncovered, and suffering redemption is shown to be more powerful, particularly when that death is followed by resurrection. Or we could see this as the beginning of the Transfiguration story, and in fact, the ones who are among them standing there who get to see the reign of God has come in power are Peter, James, and John, who get to watch the Transfiguration. That seems entirely plausible to me as well. So again, it's just not clear whether this verse really belongs to the last chapter, belongs to the next story, or some kind of transition from one to the other. You get to continue reading and asking yourself, where does verse 1 belong within the flow of the story? Then we get to verse 2, which everybody would agree, now we're actually in the Transfiguration story, regardless of where we come down with verse 1. Again, my translation. After 6 days, Jesus takes Peter and James and John and leads them up to a high mountain by themselves alone, and he was transformed before them. I think I might have a typo in here, so please excuse that. But here's what I want to pick up on. This reference, after 6 days. Not very often that Mark will use a time reference like that. A lot of times when he starts a new story, he says, and then they went to Capernaum, and then they went this, and then they went there. Sometimes he'll use a time reference. We'll see that in the resurrection story, a time reference. What 6 days might signify, I don't know, and I don't know quite what to make of this as a transition. That would be an argument. The phrase "after 6 days" would be a really good argument for saying that verse 1 belongs with what happened before, and now we're on to a new story. It could be a time marker, time divider, as it were. Or it could be a fulfillment of some sort. Some of you will not taste death until you see this. After 6 days, they get to see this. I don't quite know what to make of that phrase, but it's kind of an interesting transition between verses 1 and 2. Now, we call this the Transfiguration story. You'll notice I have the word transformed. The Greek word there is metamorpho, and that's obviously transliterated in English for metamorphosis, which means a transformation of some sort. It does appear 4 times in the Gospels, or in the New Testament rather. Here in our story, in Matthew chapter 17, in Matthew's story that we call the Transfiguration. So in both of those stories, the word translated transfigured or transfiguration is this word metamorphosis. But it also appears in Romans chapter 12, a verse that many of us were recommended to memorize along the way, and no longer be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that Paul writes to the church in Rome. It's universally the same word is translated transformed there. Just like in 2 Corinthians chapter 3. It says, all of us with unveiled faces are seeing the glory of the Lord as though reflected in the mirror, and are being transformed into the same image from one degree to another. Why it is that a word that is always translated transformed always. In the other two instances, is transformed, is somehow in this story transfigured. I would imagine that it was a decision that the King James Bible translators made in 1611, and because the story is such a signal story, the title Transfiguration just kind of became the way we talk about it, and future interpreters, either one is a legitimate translation of the word metamorpho, so they go with transfiguration, so that we'll know what we're talking about. Jesus is transformed before them. Notice, in the next verse we're going to see we're not really given a whole lot of information about what that means. And then we have to ask the question, why Peter, James, and John? And, I'm not sure why those three in particular. Let me first throw out that maybe the fact that there are three of them is in keeping with the tradition that if 2 or 3 witnesses agree on something, then they're telling the truth. Because this looks like something that had to be told later and might have met with some skepticism later because of the way it unfolds. So that might be why we have 3, but why these 3, Peter, James, and John? We do have a couple of occasions where Peter, James, and John figure in. The first is when Jesus first discloses that he's going to Jerusalem to die, it's Peter who rebukes him. So Peter really is the one who, on behalf of the others, it appears, fails that first time. And then in the third disclosure, when Jesus says he's going to Jerusalem to die, it's James and John who respond inappropriately. And they ask, well, when you get on your throne, can we sit on your right and your left? So this is all about a journey of humiliation, and all they can imagine is how they can use that as a way to elevate themselves. So in that sense, Peter, James, and John have stuck out to us a little bit in those stories. But also in chapter 14, Jesus is going to the garden to pray, and he's going to tell most of the disciples to stay here, and he's going to take Peter, James, and John with him as he goes to pray there in the garden. So, something about them, their reputation, perhaps the well-known qualities of their work among Mark's community, or just the fact that these were the 3, and for whatever reason, Jesus chose them to accompany him. But that's who goes with him. And moving on then. Here's the transformation, apparently. And his clothes began shining exceedingly white, as no fuller on earth is able this to whiten. That's awkward. It's a literal translation. I'm sorry if it sounds wooden. But notice this. It's Jesus' clothes that Mark describes as being transformed. Jesus' clothes. His clothes became shining exceedingly white. Luke and Matthew make reference to Jesus' facial appearance changing. Mark doesn't say that. So while it's very tempting to kind of hear the Moses story, when Moses came down off the mountain with his face shining, and I think that story can be one of the stories that is echoed here, but that detail is not. Mark does not say Jesus' face suddenly took on this glow. It's his clothes. Shining white, because white was a very, very difficult color to achieve in that time. You needed a fuller's brush. You needed, all kinds of scrubbing and possibilities to keep it white. And then, as soon as you go outside, you have the possibility of it not being white anymore, right? But it's Jesus' clothes that Mark signifies are whiter than can be imaginable. So we can ask ourselves, is this an echo of Exodus chapter 24? That reads this way: Then Moses went up on the mountain, and the cloud covered the mountain. And the glory of the Lord settled on Mount Sinai, and the cloud covered it for 6 days. And on the seventh day, he called out to Moses out of the cloud, a voice from the heavens. Now the appearance of the glory of the Lord was like a devouring fire on top of the mountain, in the sight of the people of Israel. Moses entered the cloud and went up on the mountain. Moses was on the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights. So there you have at least one mountaintop experience involving Moses significantly, and the glory of the Lord and the voice of the Lord coming out of the clouds. That could very much be one of the stories that's echoed in the way Mark tells his transformation story. Or it could also be an echo of 1 Kings chapter 19, which reads this way. This is the voice of God talking to Elijah, the prophet. He said, "Go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by." Now there was a great wind, so strong that it was splitting mountains and breaking rocks into pieces before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire. But the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a sound of sheer silence. There you have a story of Elijah, the prophet, on the mountain. And significantly, Elijah is going to go down from that mountain and step into trouble on behalf of God. So here we have a reference to Jesus' clothes becoming shiny. We've had a reference to the mountaintop. And now there's this. And there appeared to them Elijah with Moses. And they were speaking together with Jesus. Now I will tell you, typically the order is changed. And if you read Matthew and Luke, the order is changed. There's Moses and Elijah, the law and the prophets. For whatever reason, as Mark is telling this story, it's Elijah and Moses. Elijah with Moses. Now, Mark often tells stories very quickly and just tells you that they happen. Doesn't really go into detail. We saw that with the temptation story, right? Where Matthew and Luke have Jesus talking to Satan and describes the temptations and the responses and so forth. And with Mark, all we have is when Jesus was thrown into the wilderness by the Spirit and was there with the wild beasts and tempted for 40 days by the devil. And then it's over. Well, likewise here, we've got Elijah with Moses. They're speaking together with Jesus. We have no idea what they say or what they're talking about. Other stories will tell us they were talking about Jesus' forthcoming death, but not in Mark's story. They were speaking together, but we're not sure what they were speaking together about. And notice the way I translated this. Elijah with Moses, and they were, speaking together with Jesus. And the reason I'm doing that is because I'm not always sure that the verb to be in Greek, which would be eimi, I'm not sure if that really couples as a linking verb with the next verb that follows, like it does in English. So in English, you could say they were and speaking, and you've got a nice little linking verb, they were speaking. I'm not sure if that's quite the way that the Greek language works. The first verb is that they were. And I want to just hold that for a minute. They were. Do you realize how remarkable of a statement that is? Moses has been dead for centuries. Moses is dead. There's actually a quote in the Bible. Moses is dead. Moses is dead. Elijah didn't die. He was last seen going off in a chariot of fire. But that too was centuries before. So we've got a really interesting phrase here. If you let it speak the way it looked like it reads in Greek, Moses and Elijah were. They existed. That's another way you can translate the verb to be, right? So Moses and Elijah existed. They were. They were present. One of them dead, one of them missing for centuries, right? And there they are. That in itself is remarkable. And they're speaking with Jesus. That is also remarkable. I want to keep both of those together. So what happens then? And having responded, Peter says to Jesus, "Rabbi, it is good for us to be here, and let us make 3 tents, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." Leave it to Peter, right? Rabbi, an interesting way of addressing Jesus. We're going to hear that title only 2 other times in Mark's gospel. Peter will use it again when Jesus has cursed the fig tree and they've moved on, and when they come back, they pass the fig tree, and Peter says, "Rabbi, the fig tree that you cursed has been withered." So he'll use the term then. And then Judas will use that term. In some later manuscripts, he uses it twice. When he betrays Jesus with a kiss and the words "Rabbi." So, it's unusual to see that title, I think, in Mark's gospel. But that's Peter kind of, I would say, blurting out, "Rabbi, it's good for us to be here. Let's make 3 tents." Literally 3 skeins. And we don't know exactly what this offer implies. Some commentators think it's a reference to the building of booths that would happen during the Festival of Booths. And some feel like maybe it's a reference to the tabernacle, which specifically was a tent that would be moved from place to place and prefigured or pre-existed the temple. Or maybe it's just a way of building monuments there. But it's significant that Peter wants to build 3 of them. So in his mind, this moment is about the 3 of them: Moses, Elijah, and Jesus. And in about 2 verses, I'll show you why that might have been a mistake. At any rate, something happened. Peter blurted out, and so Mark describes in the next verse, "For he did not know how he might respond, for they became freaked out." I own this. This is my translation. If you want to use it, send me $20. Why do I say freaked out? Well, the word there, ekphoboi, and in the stem, the root of that word is phobos, which we know well, means to fear, to be afraid, and so forth. And the prefix ek means out. He's feared out, freaked out. He doesn't know what to make of this moment, and so he blurts out this offer to build 3 tents, one for each of them. It's an interesting thing that the voice has not spoken out of the cloud yet. That's not what scares Peter. It might be the shiny clothes. It might be the presence of dead people. I see dead people, maybe maybe resurrection is a scary thing. How they happen to know that this is Moses and Elijah, don't ask me. I don't think they wore name tags, and I'm relatively sure they didn't leave behind high school graduation yearbooks. So I don't know. I don't know how it's the story. It's Mark's story. He can tell it how he wants. Somehow they know this is Elijah and Moses. Something about this event has really freaked them out, feared them out. And notice they became freaked out. So it's not just Peter. He's just the mouthpiece for what they are experiencing collectively. Then now we get the cloud. And again, this seems an echo of what we read in the Moses story and in the Elijah stories. A cloud formed overshadowing them, and a voice began out of the cloud, "This is my beloved Son. Listen to him." So first we have the phrase, "This is my beloved Son." And that's a repeat of what we heard in the first chapter, verse 11, at the baptism. Only there, it seemed to have been a private message because Jesus heard it, and it was in the second person. You are my son, the beloved. With you I am well pleased. Here, we've got that other, a more general, this is my son, beloved son, or my son, the beloved. It could be translated either way. This is my beloved son. Listen to him. Now, that brings up the question of how well known, how open the Gospel of Mark is about Jesus being the Son of God. And this is a corresponding question with what we've been calling in previous classes the Messianic secret. And you know, I have my reservations about that phrase. And I do promise to talk about that in some depth this Wednesday to tell you why I have reservations about that phrase. But it's very interesting how Mark uses the phrase Son of God. So you might remember in the first verse, Mark says the gospel of Jesus Christ, and later manuscripts, probably not the earliest manuscripts, someone has added Son of God. So that may or may not be a place where Mark would use the phrase Son of God. Certainly at the baptism, the voice from the heaven declared to Jesus, you are my beloved son. So there you have a declaration of Jesus as the Son of God. And then the other clear declaration, besides our text, is at the cross. Only it's not the voice from the heavens, right? It's a Roman centurion. Truly, this was the Son of God. So you have at the beginning and at the end, at the baptism and at the death, a declaration of being that Jesus is the Son of God. Incidentally, I think that's true of our lives as well. At your baptism, you will be declared the beloved child of God. And I think at our funerals, we should restate that declaration. That's why I like to sing the song, when we are living, it is in Christ Jesus, and when we're dying, it is in the Lord. Both in our living and in our dying, we belong to God. In Mark's gospel, it happens at the baptism, it happens at the cross, and here in kind of the midpoint, more or less, of the story, before Jesus begins the road to Jerusalem, and as Jesus concludes the ministry in Galilee, so far that we have the declaration of Jesus being the beloved Son. There will be a moment in chapter 3 where Legion describes Jesus as Son of the Most High God. I've read places, I don't know this to be true, but I've read that would be more of a Gentile-y sort of way of using that phrase and less of a Jewish sort of way, because it would be presuming other gods. But we do hear those words coming out of unclean spirits in chapter 5, rather. In chapter 3, there are some spirits who see Jesus and say, you are the Son of God, and Jesus tells them to be quiet. In chapter 14, during his trial, Jesus will be silent and not answer the high priest, so the high priest will ask him, are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One? And Jesus' answer may be, I am, or it may be, am I? It kind of all depends on how you're reading that and therefore how you translate it. But the last declaration, of course, is in the 15th chapter, rather, when the centurion says, truly this man was God's son. And so the voice comes out of the cloud, declaring Jesus the divine Son, and then saying, listen to him. And it's a legitimate question to ask, listening to what exactly? Because so far Jesus hasn't said anything. We know that he's talking with Moses and Elijah. We have no idea what's being said then. So it would seem rather to be a reference to, you know, the full complement of Jesus' teaching as opposed to what he happens to be saying here right now. So this is not so much, hey, shut up, he's talking. Not that, as much as it is, stop talking, listen to him. And then verse 8, And suddenly, having looked around, they did not see anybody but Jesus alone with them. And just like that, a moment that every Hebrew in the history of Israel would love to have, to see, Moses and Elijah and Messiah standing there talking together on the top of the mountain with shiny raiment. This moment, this appearance that everybody would give a life to see. I mean, this is the glory that we're looking for. This is Moses and Elijah, the law and the prophets. This is the Messiah. This is the one who comes to fulfill the promise of the law. But just like that, it's over. Kind of in a shoemaker and the elves sort of way. It seems like because Peter had to blurt out and say something, the moment's lost. We might be a little hard on Peter at this time. The moment would have to end sooner or later, one guesses. But it sure seems to happen like that once Peter speaks out and the declaration happens. Moses and Elijah are gone. Only Jesus. Only Jesus. He took them up there, just them to be alone. He was in that great company of the law and the prophets. And now it's Jesus alone. And I'm wondering if that was part of the problem with Peter's suggesting to build 3 tents, because it's not about the threesome, it's about the onesome. And maybe that's what Peter needs to be paying attention to. So, after being with the prophetic founder and the prophetic restorer of Israel, and after Peter offers to build 3 tents, now there's just one. And this is what I think is kind of the closing end of the Transfiguration story, as it's called. And in their going down off the mountain, he charged them in order that they might recount nothing that they saw until after the Son of Man would be raised out of the dead. So you have, he charged them. This is the word that Jesus has used 3 other times, or that Mark has used 3 other times. It seems to be a strong order, okay? After Jairus' daughter is raised, Jesus strictly ordered them they should tell no one about them and give her something to eat. After healing a lot of people in chapter 7, Jesus ordered them to tell no one, but the more he ordered it, the more they told. And to the 12 in the boat, this is the phrase that's used there when Jesus cautions them, watch out, beware. He strictly charged them, watch out, beware of the yeast of the Pharisees and the yeast of Herod. Now, the fact that Jesus orders silence about this, at least temporary silence, continues to fit within what some people call the messianic secret motif. Jesus will often tell someone, tell no one about this, right at that moment when we think this is exactly the right time to proclaim it and tell the whole world. And that happens again and again in Mark's Gospel. And so since the beginning of the 20th century, in the work of William Brady, he tagged this with the title, The Messianic Secret. Now, you may be familiar with someone who is very much opposed to that title and to the argument that Brady is making, and that was Albert Schweitzer, also a very fine biblical scholar in his own right. But Brady argues that it's characteristic of Mark's Gospel that they are not to proclaim Jesus as the Messiah, they're not to promote Jesus as the Messiah, until after the death and resurrection. And there are some ways that I certainly agree with that. I struggle with the word secret. I still think that's a misnomer, nonetheless. But this is a very, very interesting argument, and has been the predominant way in the 20th and 21st century of thinking about Mark's story and that constant motif of Jesus silencing people. I don't know if it's exactly there are a lot of variations of it, but it would seem to me that Rede's argument has kind of won the day, and this is the basis from which most biblical scholars seem to start when they try to name what's going on in Mark's gospel. Notice the phrase here, though, the Son of Man. And this is the phrase that Jesus will often use as a self-referential phrase in the third person when he's talking about his forthcoming suffering and death. So it's an interesting phrase. We'll have to sit with that sometime and kind of look at some of the Old Testament roots of that phrase. But there is a rather consistent thing that the minute someone tries to elevate Jesus too much, he goes to this phrase as his way of referring to himself and his forthcoming suffering. And so notice now, he says, say nothing until the Son of Man would be raised out of the dead. All right, so Jesus has already made one reference to rising from the dead. And that was in the first disclosure that he made that he's going to die, right? He's going to Jerusalem, he'll be rejected, he will suffer, he will die, and on the third day, he will rise from the dead. So this is not new. But we'll see what happens in the next verse. Verse 10, and they kept the word to themselves, discussing what the rising of the dead is. So this phrase, kept the word, means that they kept it within. They obeyed this command to silence. And then they're discussing among themselves what this rising from the dead is. Now, a lot of translations here, including the one we read earlier, have what rising of the dead might mean, or what it means. This is the verb to be here. It's typically translated is rather than means. I don't know why they're going in that direction. But it seems a little curious to me that the three who have just seen Moses, who was once dead, standing up there talking to Jesus, and Elijah, who's been missing for centuries, it seems that this may be, again, the disciples just not fully grasping what they have just seen in and of itself. What might rising from the dead be? They just saw it. Could be. At any rate, they seem somewhat confused. And so they're discussing among themselves what this rising from the dead might be. Then this happens in verse 11, and they were interrogating him, Jesus, saying, the scribes say that Elijah is bound to come first. So there are two words here that you've seen me translate this way consistently, and so I'm trying to stay consistent, right? And the first is the word for interrogate, epiretao. It seems a little more than simply asked, because in Mark's gospel, whenever someone asks a question using this particular verb, there seems to be a bit of a challenge to it. So I want to raise the possibility that when they start asking Jesus this question in verse 11, that in some ways this is a bit of a challenge. Maybe not to Jesus, maybe to the scribes, but it seems like this is a challenging word, a word that introduces a challenge more than simply an inquiry, okay? And another verb here that you see me translate consistently is the scribes say that Elijah is bound to come first. Many translations will simply have must come first, but I do want to keep that verb, deo, alive throughout Mark's gospel. It is a destiny verb, and Jesus uses it. The Son of Man must. The Son of Man is bound to go to Jerusalem, to be rejected, to suffer. This is a very important verb, in Mark's gospel, and I don't like to see it kind of minimized into a some kind of an imperative voice or something like that. This is a verb in and of its own right. And the question that they put to Jesus has to do with the scribes, not the scriptures, but the scribes. It's the same root. It's from where we get our word grammar, or the writings, graphics. It's the same root, but they don't say the scriptures say, they say the scribes say. So what we might be getting is that the question of the Messiah, the coming of the Messiah, what that looks like, how that's prepared, how that's carried out, what must happen first, what then happens last. This may not be something that every Jewish person has the same expectation. There may be a very, very vivid conversation ongoing about what this is going to look like. And so in this question, they say the scribes say that Elijah is bound to come first. And the very end of the Old Testament, more or less, in the book of Malachi, has this in the 4th chapter. And I like it because it brings together a reference to Moses and to Elijah. It says, "Remember the teachings of my servant Moses, the statutes and the ordinances that I commanded him at Horeb for all Israel. Lo, I send you the prophet Elijah before the great and terrible day of the Lord comes. He will turn the hearts of the parents to their children, and the hearts of the children to their parents, so that I will not come and strike the land with a curse." Now, when this is written, the historic person, Elijah, has been gone forever. I mean, he's just been gone for a while. This is not a pre-Elijah's birth story, okay? Moses has been dead for a long time. Elijah's been gone for a considerable amount of time. And here in Malachi, it's a reference to the teachings of Moses. So he's kind of the constitutive lawgiver, and the restoration of all things by Elijah. I am told that this is one reason why at many Jewish meals there will be the empty chair, Elijah's chair, because Elijah will come and prepare the way and turn the hearts of the parents to their children, the children to their parents, to restore all things, and so forth. So they've just seen the transformation. They've just seen Jesus in conversation with Moses and Elijah. They've just heard the voice that says, "This is my beloved son, listen to him." They've just seen the disappearance of Moses and Elijah, and Jesus alone left with them. And now, on the way back, they're perhaps interrogating, perhaps asking Jesus, what's the deal with Elijah? The scribes say Elijah must come first. And that is indeed the expectation that many people had from reading Micah. But again, I want to say, I'm not sure if every single Jewish person in the greater Palestinian area all expected the same thing. Because we know that there was at least one group of persons, the Sadducees, who are described as not believing in resurrection from the dead. So I want to just say that I too often we treat all these first century folk as if they all thought the same thing. And I want to say that a lot of these arguments are living arguments. The idea of a Messiah, coming in power and so forth, a lot of that language didn't really start taking place until about the 2nd century before the Common Era. This is not something that's swept all the way back to necessarily to Moses and so forth. So what we have are some novel theologies, some relatively new theologies, some theologies of necessity, some theologies that have evolved over time, all of which I think are probably in some kind of living conversation with each other rather than these kind of fixed entities. So they interrogate Jesus. The scribes say that Elijah is bound to come first. It looked like maybe that's supposed to be a question. It's not really, I could translate it as a question, but I wasn't sure which way to go. Do the scribes say that Elijah must come first? Or what does it mean when the scribes say Elijah must come first? Why do the scribes say Elijah must come first? It wasn't clear to me exactly where the question was there, so I left it more or less as a statement. And here's Jesus' response. Yet he was declaring to them, Elijah indeed, having come first, does restore all things, and how has it been written about the Son of Man, that he may suffer and be despised? Now, if you're like me, the first part of that response and the second part of that response seem to be changing topics. And that might be very, very intentional. I have, rather than Jesus saying to them, lego, or answering them, apokrinomai, these are very, very, very common words. And Jen, if you're listening, you've got to know how to decline the verbs lego and apokrinomai, because you will see them over and over and over again. That's the word for saying, and the other is the word for answering. But here we have a different word that's not used very often. It's theami, and it means something like declaring. Declaring. We're going to hear it in chapter 9. After Jesus teaches that whoever receives a child in his name receives him, John will declare that they saw somebody casting out demons in Jesus' name who wasn't with them, so they stopped him. In chapter 10, when Jesus is in conversation with a wealthy man who asks how to inherit the reign of God, and Jesus cites some of the commands, the man declares he's been keeping all of those since his youth. Later in chapter 10, Peter will assert that they, unlike some folks, have left everything to follow Jesus, and Jesus will declare, truly, I tell you, no one has left home and field and family who will not receive 100-fold back, as well as persecutions in the age to come. In chapter 12, Jesus is confronted with a trick question about eternal life, and he declares, is this not why you are wrong? My favorite response ever in Scripture. And then in chapter 14, after Jesus tells the 12 that they will all fall away, Peter declares that while the others may do so, he will never do so. So it seems like this verb is a little more than simply answering. It looks like someone is staking out a position. So what I'm doing here, folks, is I'm hearing this conversation coming down off the mountain as a little bit of a contested conversation. They're interrogating Jesus. The scribes say that Elijah must come first. Jesus declares to them, yes, the scribes are right. The scriptures are right. Elijah must come first, as it's been written. But how has it been written about the Son of Man that he must suffer and be despised? It seems to me that Jesus is trying to push back. Yes, Elijah must come first. But we're talking about the Son of Man. Think about how it's been written that the Son of Man must suffer and be despised. Because if you go back to Malachi, Elijah will come and turn the hearts of the parents to their children and children to their parents so that there won't be judgment. Jesus is facing a difficult situation that hasn't been restored. People have not turned their hearts to one another. In fact, as the Son of Man, Jesus is going to be killed. So it seems to me that in some respects, the disciples are trying to make that mountaintop experience into something to say, Elijah's going to come, set everything right, and we'll be into the promise. And what Jesus is saying is that Elijah does come, but the Son of Man has to suffer. We can't circumvent the suffering of the Son of Man, which it seems to me the disciples still haven't gotten into their heads that suffering is a necessary part before you get to the glorification of the Son of Man. And then Jesus followed by saying, "But I say to you, Elijah has come. And they did to him as they were wanting, just as it is written about him." They did to him as they were wanting. You remember when Simon Peter took Jesus aside and began rebuking him for saying he was going to die? And Jesus told him, "Get behind me, Satan. You have your mind on things that are human, not on divine things. You're being mindful of human things, not divine things." It seems like while there is this divine plan, this destiny, this verb deo that keeps popping up, God's divine plan will constantly be in contesting with human will. And humans do to Elijah what they want. Now, we imagine that Jesus here is talking about John the Baptizer. Mark doesn't say that, but we do have the impression from the way Mark describes John the Baptizer that he is this elegiac figure, a figure of Elijah in Jesus' life. We have the description of John the Baptizer clothed in camel's hair, wearing a leather belt around his waist, eating locusts and wild honey, very similar to how Elijah is described. We have John pointing to the one who comes after him, which would make him in some respects the forerunner, like Elijah, the voice crying out in the wilderness. And even John's death at the hand of Herod and Herodias seemed very reminiscent of the struggles, ongoing struggles, constant struggles, life and death struggles that Elijah had with the king and queen Ahab and Jezebel. So in some respects, I think it's legitimate for us to assume that for Mark and for Jesus in the Gospel of Mark, John the Baptizer is this coming of Elijah. That Elijah has come, and they did to him what they were wanting, just as it is written about him. But then, the question comes up, what is this conversation coming down the mountain about? It's not clear. It's not clear to me. It's not clear to most of the commentaries I'm reading, because they all kind of go in different directions. And I don't know if it's clear to you. I want to suggest that, again, the disciples are hoping for a glory of the Christ without a cross of the Christ. And that on the way down from this mountain, Jesus silences them, because they are not going to understand what they just saw until they see Jesus die on the cross and be raised from death. And even now, after having seen Moses talking to Jesus, they're still asking, what is this raising from the dead all about? So I think this is a bit of an argument coming down this mountain, and that it displays that Peter, James, and John still haven't caught on to what's going on with Jesus and how the cross is a necessary part of his glory. I may be wrong, and if I am, you can join us tonight, Wednesday night at 7 o'clock, and tell me all about it. Until then, be well.